Hi everybody, welcome to an overview of the Phaser 3 game engine. So Phaser 3 is a game engine for JavaScript. It's a library, and what it does is it provides us with a really impressive array of different features to implement the kinds of things that come up when we're trying to make a video game. So things like animation, things like physics, user input, particle effects, a camera, and on and on. Phaser 3 does a huge amount. And if you've had any experience maybe in trying to implement some of those ideas yourself, say collisions in a sort of physical world in a program, you probably know how difficult some of these things are to do on your own. Phaser 3, the idea is to make common game development tasks much, much easier. Now, in doing that, Phaser 3 is also a very big library. It does a lot of different things, and there's no way that we're really going to be able to cover all of that in these lessons here. So what we're going to focus on is getting a basic project structure that we can use again and again, and we're going to engage with some of the most kind of fundamental ideas that Phaser 3 makes available to us. And then from there, we'll of course look at how the documentation works, what kind of help is available, with the idea of becoming independent and being able to use Phaser 3 in our own projects. So to begin with, the first thing that we always should do, right, is we should go and get to know Phaser 3 on its own terms by going to to its website. And its website is available here, phaser.io. Now, what can we learn from this website? What does it tell us about Phaser 3? Well, it tells us what it is over here, right? It's a desktop and mobile HTML5 game framework, or game engine, and it's a fast, free, and open source framework for Canvas and WebGL-powered browser games. So it's focused on the browser. That makes sense since it's a JavaScript library, right? Now, if we scroll down a little further, we get to find out sort of the major features that Phaser 3 is giving us. You can see that there's a lot of stuff that it does, right? And if you mouse over these different features, you can get a little sense of what's available. One way that Phaser works that we'll encounter as we go on is that it's kind of built up of systems. So there's a particle system, there's a camera system, there's a physics system, etc. And so Phaser has all of these things built in that you can use or not use depending on the kind of thing that you're making, right? So most of these features here are about different systems that the game makes available, as well as things like trying to be mobile friendly, for example. It's blazingly fast on desktop apparently. Wonderful. If we continue to scroll down, we'll see some news. Obviously, that might be a teensy bit more relevant to us once we are actually Phaser 3 developers. It's quite a bit of news. And then if we go all the way down to the bottom, towards the bottom, there's a quick start guide. That could be useful if we weren't just doing that kind of thing ourselves right now. So we won't worry about this just for the moment. And then right at the bottom, you can see some examples of games that were made with Phaser that can give you a sort of a general idea of what's possible with the engine. If we take a look at 1942, for example, you can see that somebody's made a kind of classic top-down airplane shootery thing. I could fire that up and we could see what it looks like. It's loading. There we go. Shift to fire, left shift to space to fire, left shift to roll. Sure. Yeah. So you can see that Phaser 3 is going to be able to let us do some fairly traditional things. Obviously, what we'll be interested in doing in the context of a class like this is that we're going to want to... Boom, I died. On purpose. That was totally on purpose. We're going to want to probably try and do some things that are a little more unconventional than this, but it's nice to know that the kind of fundamental building blocks of what we might think of as traditional games are very much present in how Phaser 3 works. So what else does the website tell us? Well, if we look at the navigation up here at the top, we've got the news, which we were just looking at before. We can see that we've got a Learn category. That's where we're going to find tutorials and documentation about the library. That's not actually where I would start, however. Downloading the library is obviously going to be important once we start building a project. We'll get onto that in the next lesson. For now, we're just going to focus on what Phaser 3 kind of is. And here we've got the examples, which is super important in the context of Phaser 3. And so I want to go and have a look at this. It's also worth remembering that there's a very large community associated with Phaser 3. Because it is open source, there are a lot of different people working on the engine itself, and it has a huge community of people who are working with the library, myself included, who will happily help each other out, post things on forums and on Stack Exchange and so forth. So in terms of really working with Phaser, the real place that you're probably going to spend a lot of your time is with the examples. And indeed, that's how I'm going to kind of focus on the idea of how we learn to use it in large part. So let's go and look at this just for a moment so that we have a sense of it in our heads. So here's the Phaser 3 examples page. And you can see that there's a lot of categories here. Not all of them are going to really make immediate sense. We've got actions, which has got this weird kind of diamond of diamonds. Animation, that makes sense. That's something we want to do. Audio, sure. Cache, I mean, that sounds like a thing, but not necessarily something I want to do. Camera, components, demo scene, depth sorting, display, and on and on and on. There's a lot of material here, right? And these are just categories. These are not examples. These are categories of examples. One thing I do want to note, just because I've scrolled down to the bottom here on purpose, is this final example here, which says swap to Phaser 2 examples. And this is something that's really important to know, is that the current version of Phaser is Phaser 3, and it's a major version change from Phaser 2, which was understandably the previous version. They're so different from one another that they're not compatible. And what that means is that the documentation for Phaser 2 doesn't really help with Phaser 3. The examples for Phaser 2 don't help with Phaser 3. People giving you advice on the internet about Phaser 2 doesn't really help with Phaser 3. And so I highlight this just to point out that there are a lot of people still using Phaser 2 because they grew up with it or whatever, and because it was a good game engine as well. But we're going to be using Phaser 3, and it's really important to know that Phaser 2 exists and to make sure that when you're looking for help with Phaser 3, you make sure that you use resources for Phaser 3 and not accidentally for Phaser 2. It can lead to so much confusion. It's really worth double checking that the resources that you're using are for Phaser 3. Okay, so I said we would be working from these examples a lot and that they were kind of central. So let's take a look at an actual example. We'll look at something sort of classic. So one of the really important categories here on the examples page, it's really worth kind of browsing through all of them to get a sense of what's possible, like exploding packs of cards apparently here on input. But one of the very important categories is this game objects category. You can see it's got a ton of things inside of it, 470 files. That's like 470 examples in there. So it's a really, really big category. And the reason for that is that the game objects category, if I click through to it, are all the kinds of things that can exist in your game, like game objects. This makes sense. Bitmap text, for example, graphics, a group is important, an image, lighting is there, meshes are there, particles are there, shaders are there, ropes are there apparently. That's great. Sprites, video, tile sprites, etc. Text. There's a lot of stuff that can be put into your game. And each one of these things on its own can be quite a complex sort of idea. So let's take a look at the sprites category. Okay, so a sprite in a video game is any kind of image, may or may not be animated, that you put onto the canvas of your game and move around, make explode, whatever it is that you're kind of doing. You can see that there's a few examples of what it means to work with sprites in Phaser. They are completely fundamental to Phaser 3's kind of idea of how you make a game. You kind of make the visual aspect with sprites to a large extent. So let's look at a specific example. Let's look at moving sprite here, just to get a sense of what a single example looks like. So here's a rabbit moving from left to right across the canvas. You're probably familiar with this as a sort of elementary visual programming exercise. So every Phaser example comes with this basic kind of running version of what the code is talking about, of course. And then down below, you get the actual code that is needed to create that example. Now, that's great, right? So you get the thing and the code. There's a couple of caveats here. I think you'll probably recognize them as soon as you look at this. One of the caveats is that there are no comments here. There is no commenting and there is no explanation anywhere of what's going on, which is fine, but you know, that puts a little extra load on us to kind of understand the kinds of things that are going on in an example so that we can take the aspects of it that we actually need for our project. So that's thing one, no commenting, no explanation. Thing two, as you can see by the presence of this var keyword instead of let, this is not written in ES6, which is the style of JavaScript we've been using in this course. Okay, so we would use let here in theory. It's also the case that we couldn't just copy and paste this example into our own project and expect it to run. The eagle-eyed among you probably noticed that nowhere here does this example include the Phaser library itself, so it wouldn't run for that reason. We also don't have this image, right? It's asking for an image in the assets sprites folder called bunny.png, but we don't have it. So that is just to say that these examples show you how to do things, but it's not necessarily the case that you can just sort of cut and paste and run them yourself, okay? So those are some important caveats. The other caveat that will become a little bit more important later, and we'll talk about it again, is that the way that this example is structured is not the way that we're going to structure our code. This is a very, very basic way of writing a Phaser kind of a game, but it's not quite as sophisticated as the version that we are going to be using. Despite that, we can look at this example and get a sense of what's kind of going on, right? In particular, we can see that there's some kind of configuration going on. This is configuring the game, because we can see that it's used down here when the game is being created, apparently. And you can see that there are some, hopefully, fairly self-explanatory things in here, as well as some more curious things. We can see that it's using WebGL. We can see that there's some dimensions here. We would probably assume these are for the canvas. And then there's something about a scene here with these function names that are mirrored down below. And that kind of actually gets at the heart of how at least an individual scene in a Phaser game works, which is that you have the idea of preloading. We're already familiar with this. This is the idea that a program might well want to load things like images and sounds before it runs so that those things are available when the program actually begins. So Phaser 3 has that with this preload function in this case. We have a thing called create. This is a function that happens once at the start of this scene in the game. So it's a lot like setup in p5.js, for example. And then we have an update function, which is a function that is called once per frame. It's a lot like the draw function from p5.js, right? And so you can see that they preload an image of the rabbit, which we saw above. By loading it in the preload function, they create a sprite in the create function that they do once at the beginning, and then they are manipulating that sprite's X property, its position horizontally on the canvas, once per frame in the update function. They're adding 2 to it each frame, and then if it reaches greater than 950, it goes back to the left-hand side of the canvas. It's a classic kind of little programming exercise, right? And that's what's making that happen, okay? So the way that these examples work are they show you how to do a very specific thing in this structure of preload, create, and update. They don't provide you with comments, but one nice thing is that at least generally speaking, Phaser 3's code is fairly straightforward to understand. So that's the examples. We'll be spending a lot more time with those as we go through the lessons. Let's head back to the home page. The other big thing I definitely want to take a look at is the Learn button, right? So what are the learning resources that they make available to us as developers in Phaser 3? There's a Getting Started tutorial, which is very useful if you're looking for that kind of thing. And there's also a Making Your First Game tutorial, which will show you how to make a platformer, basically. Now, these two tutorials, they're well worth doing, but they're also the kinds of things that we'll be covering in the current lesson. So you can do them as a way of brushing up afterwards if you want to. They foreground the 1,772, goodness me, code examples that we were just looking at moments ago as a really central learning resource, and I agree with them there. That's kind of how I do most of my work with Phaser 3, is looking through at the examples of what's possible. And then very importantly down here, we get the API documentation. That's obviously super crucial for us. We do want to know what the very, very specific aspects of how this library works are. And that's in the API documentation. The other thing that's very important right now is 888 tutorials. Doing tutorials, of course, is a great way to learn new techniques and to get comfortable with a library, being taken step by step through how to do specific things. And again, these lessons are kind of like that kind of idea as well. So just quickly so that we lay eyes on it, let's click through to the API documentation. So it's the Phaser HTML5 game framework. The thing about the Phaser HTML5 game framework and its API documentation is it's pretty intense. So I'm not actually going to make a case that we should spend lots and lots of time reading the API when we are learning how to use Phaser. As I said, I'm interested in mostly focusing on the examples. However, let's take a look at a little bit of documentation just to get a quick sense of what there is. So I'm going to go to game objects again, since we were talking about sprites before. You can see there's just like a flat listing of every single kind of game object. You can see that there are more game objects here than were listed in the examples page. So that's one thing about the API documentation, right, is that it will tend to have more information than there are examples. But let's just scroll down to the one that we were talking about, which is Sprite. So phaser.gameobjects.sprite. And here we actually get the documentation for this particular part of how Phaser works. And you can see that it's really long. This page is really long. Like if I were to just scroll down through it, you would be like, goodness gracious me, that is a lot of information. We are not going to just read these pages, right? That's not how we're going to learn how to use Phaser 3. What we're going to do, generally speaking, is work with the examples, and then if we really, really want to know the specifics about a property of a game object, for example, or a method that's available, then we might read the documentation to find out very specifically how something works. So, for example, if we were wondering what the active property means, here they say members, by the way. A member is the same kind of thing as a property on a class. If we click on active, the good thing here, right, is that we do actually at least get a brief description of what this means, the active state of this game object. A game object with an active state of true is processed by the scene's update list if added to it. An active object is one which is having its logic and internal systems updated. So you can also see, right, that the documentation is pretty focused on technical language around how the overall library works. What this sort of actually means is that if you set the active property of an object to false, for example, it'll kind of stop doing anything in the system. It won't be displayed, for example. And it won't collide with anything, etc., because it's no longer active. Because the documentation is not necessarily super explanatory, let us say, these are often things that we end up having to experiment with anyway. But one nice thing is, if we look down here in the left-hand side, we can see, you can read potential here. You can find things in here that might make you think, oh, well, that's interesting that I can do that. Say, oh, well, I can tint a sprite, so I guess I can change its color, but I can also tint its bottom left and tint the bottom right. That sounds interesting. That's actually the potential for kind of gradient tints being expressed there. And then there's also, a bunch of methods. These are things that we can do with a sprite. And again, there's a lot of possibilities here that we're, again, not just going to read exhaustively. We will return to these if we need them based on what we're seeing in the examples. So just to say, that the documentation is here, it's ultra specific, and the examples are generally speaking going to be easier to use, but it's still worth, of course, knowing that the API is available and that it does have at least some description of what on earth is going on with this profusion of different aspects of the library. Okay, so for now, I'm going to just stay away from the API because it's a little much. Final thing that we should take a look at, right, is the download section. We want to know how to get hold of the library. And the way that we do it is we click on their big fancy GitHub button here, download Phaser from GitHub, download as a zip or fork it, they say. And here we've got these buttons along the top here that are going to be one way that we can obtain the library. For example, we most often want the min.js version of a library. So if I click this button, it will download the file representing Phaser. So if I click it there, you can see down here in my browser, it's downloaded phaser.min.js, and I could include that in my project with a script tag by putting that file into the project in my JavaScript folder. Or if I scroll down a little bit, I can also get Phaser by just using a script tag from the CDN, right? So if I wanted phaser.min.js for the latest version, which is 3.53.1, I could just copy this script tag, and that's almost certainly what I'm going to end up doing, just because it's so much simpler than downloading a file and copying it. You know, God forbid I should have to do that. Okay, so that's the gist, right? Phaser 3 is a giant game engine. It does a lot. We are going to learn some of the fundamentals of how it works, and we are going to point into the examples, especially in order to figure out what's possible and how to do those things. And let's get started and find out how to structure a simple Phaser 3 project that we can then kind of use for the rest of our Phaser 3 using lives. Indeed. See you in the next video.